Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today. Thank you for joining our webinar titled Migrate, Sync, and Analyze using OrientDB Enterprise 3 Teleporter. In our current world of polyglot solutions, it's vitally important to be able to move your traditional data into a modern multi-model graph system to take advantage of advanced traversals and analytics. At the end of the webinar, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. The question box can be found on the left-hand side of the screen. You may submit your questions at any time, but we will wait until the end of the presentation to try to answer them for you. My name is Colin Leister. I'm the Director of Pre-Sales Engineering with OrientDB, and I'd like to introduce you to one of our partners, Robert Schneider.
Hey, thank you, Colin. I appreciate that. I'm Robert Schneider with Wise Clouds. Delighted to be here with you guys today. We are a training and consulting partner with OrientDB and very excited about the opportunity to talk about how to use the teleporter aspect of OrientDB Enterprise to bring information from your legacy relational databases over to the modern multi-model graph database in OrientDB. So let's talk about what we're going to be covering over the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to begin by telling you about just a quick background about why multi-model databases are so relevant in today's computing environment. And once we've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to move in and tell you a little bit about OrientDB. Colin and I will be describing some of its major features, which then tees things up to go into a discussion about the various integration options that you have. And there are actually quite a few of them in the OrientDB platform. But what you're here for today, of course, is to learn about the Enterprise, OrientDB Enterprise 3.0 Teleporter and how that can help you in various integration scenarios. So we'll tell you about that product, that portion of the OrientDB platform, and then we'll cover several different scenarios about how Teleporter can help you move information from a relational database platform over to OrientDB, and then even move information back, be able to analyze that information, and so on. And we'll close things out with some guidelines about how you might be able to get started on your exploration of OrientDB and OrientDB Teleporter. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the benefits of multi-model databases and why these are so important. So first of all, one of the things that we think is most attractive about a multi-model database is that, as the name would surmise, or you surmise from the name, it's meant for storing information in different types of formats, particularly documents and graph, although there are other options as well, which we'll be describing. The reason that these platforms are becoming so popular is driven by a lot of different things, but not the least of which is the advent of big data. Big data in particular, the aspects of the volume of information that floods in to your modern enterprise processing systems, the variety of information, the different types of formats that data is, and of course the volume and speed of that information all are big arguments in favor of looking at technology such as multi-model databases. In particular, we think about the fact that a lot of information today is unstructured in nature. The relational databases are great at working with information that is very highly structured into tables and columns and rows within those tables, but in the world that we're interacting with now, we don't see that level of rigidity of the information that we're capturing. It's a lot more fluid, and multi-model databases thrive in that kind of environment. And as we'll see with Teleporter later on in the presentation, what's great about these new systems, OrientDB in particular, is that you can bring them into your organization in a way that does not disrupt any of your existing applications. So you can augment things and take advantage of the new functionality without then needing to go back and re-architect existing applications. Colin, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, Rob, is the beauty of a multi-model database is you don't have to compromise your design. You can use the best model that fits your application. And maybe you need a graph data model, and for some of the vertices and edges, maybe you need to store JSON data. Maybe you need to store embedded image files. With a true multi-model database, you can do these things without having to compromise anything in your solution. Instead of maintaining, say, separate relational database and a separate document store and even a separate search engine, you can avoid the whole polyglot solution syndrome and use an integrated, the integrated capabilities of a single multi-model database.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So OrientDB really broke new ground when it comes to multi-model databases. This is really the first one that is native. It's not a layer that is placed over some existing technology. It was designed from the ground up to support a lot of different types of formats of information. And I won't rattle off all of these individual ones for you, but as you look at the different types of formats that you see here on the screen, if you combine what you've got already in your relational databases and you've got these new ways of storing information, document and graph being two of the most prominent, but even key value and spatial information beneath that, this is a very powerful platform. It's allowing you to do all these different types of native storage formats and yet be able to leverage them in a very highly efficient, fast kind of way without having to go through any kind of strange translation layers or other types of artificial impediments that can slow your applications, can cause a lot of complications for your development efforts and so on. It's really nice. It's based in a native multi-model format, allowing you to choose the appropriate data model that you want for the particular problem at hand. It's very possible, and Colin will allude to this in a couple of minutes, you may be building applications that have a combination of some graph information and some document information that maybe breaks down to key values or to JSON information, whatever that might be. You don't have to choose or can make a compromise. You can do whatever model you want, all under the same platform in OrientDB.
One thing I think I would add to that to really emphasize what we mean by native is that OrientDB was designed from the ground up to support these different models. And it does so without compromising speed or the features that you would expect to have.
Okay, thanks. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the advantages that we see in the OrientDB platform. And I'm going to go through these kind of at a high level, and Colin can add some additional thoughts about what he's seen actually out there in the field with these types of advantages. So let's begin by talking about the performance capabilities of OrientDB. Because it is a native platform, we see much faster performance, and that native capabilities that are built in to OrientDB means that the navigation across a graph is extremely fast. The designers of OrientDB, which I think was a really brilliant thing to do, rather than trying to force the users to learn some proprietary language that they've never seen before, the OrientDB multi-model API uses standard SQL with a couple of extensions, and by doing that, it allows you to be able to leverage the experience you've already got in your organization to build your applications. Colin will talk a little bit about some of the scalability capabilities built into OrientDB, but we can get between the graph navigation that's inherent in the platform and some of the distributed capabilities in the platform, you can massively scale up your applications. OrientDB was also designed to be very much a modern platform in that you do not need to invest a lot in the servers and in the staffing to maintain those servers. So the TCO was very much of a major decision in the design philosophy for OrientDB. And I'll close out here by talking a little bit about security. Very, very fine-grained security down to the record level, which is something you generally don't see in these types of platforms and multi-model platforms. OrientDB did put a lot of effort into coming up with a security model that is sophisticated enough that you can get the job done, but also simple enough to maintain. And we'll talk a little bit about some of OrientDB's other features later on, but through its object orientation and class hierarchies, you can do all sorts of really interesting things and powerful things with inheriting security roles, and again, ties in very nicely to the ease of administration of the platform. Colin, what would you add to that?
I would just add a few things. Say, talking about scalability, OrientDB does scale up very well because of its design, as Rob commented. At the lowest level, the way records are linked together, even if you have, say, 10 billion records versus just 100 records, it doesn't really affect the system in that the way they're linked together the access is still just as quick. You don't have this exponential problem of growth where it slows down, so it's really important. Also, you can scale horizontally in that OrientDB has an underlying architecture of storing records called clusters, and you can store those in a configuration that can be distributed and scales out horizontally. You can actually choose which nodes these clusters and records end up living on. As far as the TCO, or total cost of ownership, referring back to our multi-model benefits we talked about, that's really a big key in that the very reason you can reduce the total number of database systems to purchase, learn, and maintain reduces the TCO. Talking about security, I would just add that we support users and roles at the database level. We also support users and roles at the system level, which just means that you can create roles that affect multiple databases instead of just one, as well as the overall system. Our security module is extremely extensible. It's easy to write your own authenticators and authorizers if you need to, and it's also fairly trivial with the right permissions to intercept and monitor security events in the system. Rob?
Okay, thanks, Colin. So I'm going to pivot now, and we're going to talk about specifically the options we've got for integrating information into OrientDB. And there's a lot of them, as you'll see here in a moment. And then we're going to drill down on, after that, into Teleporter itself. Okay, so integration is a fact of life in any kind of modern application, any kind of environment. You're always moving information around, or at least trying to tie it together. And I want to tell you about several different options you've got if you have decided to deploy OrientDB. So I'm going to begin with some of the one-off that you might use kind of just to play around with things or to do some basic experimentation, and move more to the production-ready enterprise-style approaches that you're likely to use if you're building a mission-critical application, or any application for that matter. But let's dive into this, and then we'll cue things up very nicely for Teleporter. So the OrientDB Studio presents a really nice graphical web-based approach to interact with your database visually, doing all sorts of things, starting servers, shutting things down, interacting with SQL, things like that. From an integration perspective, you might use Studio to load information in kind of on a one-off basis. You wouldn't do this on a production style, but it's really useful for prototyping, making sure that things are going to work together just fine. If you're more inclined to use a non-graphical interface, a console interface, or maybe something remote where you don't have the ability to run a browser, the OrientDB console is perfectly fine for that. Again, really good for doing quick little record exports or imports, very, very straightforward. Not something you'd likely bring into production with you. The API, the multi-model API that I was describing earlier on in the presentation, allows you to now start doing programmatic integration. So one application could be speaking to an OrientDB database and a relational database and moving information back and forth across the APIs, maybe JDBC on the relational side, maybe OrientDB's native model, or even OrientDB's JDBC API, whatever that might be. But there's no human interaction. That's just an application talking from point A to point B, maybe to point C, whatever it might be. When you start thinking about the more robust industrial grade type of interactions or integrations, we look at things like OrientDB's extract, transform, and load ETL. Very common abbreviation we see in all sorts of different types of platforms. Works really well with the data formats you see on your screen right there. This is very common what you might use if you wanted to do a one-time information upload from one platform into OrientDB, whatever you might like to do. ETL, it lets you do that and kind of chain together the way that the information flows from point A to point B. Now, if you are one of the customers that is moving from platforms like Neo4j over to OrientDB, there's a specialized tool called Neo4j to OrientDB import. A surprise, surprise on the name of that. But that's what was designed to allow you to facilitate that approach to go from Neo4j into OrientDB. But really, if you're looking to do the integration between relational platforms and OrientDB on a regular basis, and you're interested in having OrientDB pick up the schema and the data model that you've got in your relational database and bring it across so that that can be preserved and save you a lot of time and effort, you're definitely going to want to look at Teleporter, which of course is the major aspect of today's webinar, and we're going to be going into that from this point forward in the webinar. So we'll carry forward on that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about OrientDB Teleporter. Colin will tell you a little bit about it from some additional technical perspectives. Basically, Teleporter is meant to integrate relational database data from major platforms like Oracle and MySQL and a number of other ones, to do it in such a way that provides an attractive visual interface. That we didn't want people to have to go and write low-level code to do this. We wanted to make it easy to pick up the relational data that you've already got, including the schema and data models that you might already have in place, and of course you would have those in place, and bring those across and preserve them to bring them over to the OrientDB multi-model graph environment without causing you to have a lot of re-architecture headaches. So it was designed to automate that and to really take advantage of the full range of OrientDB's capabilities. And again, the database platforms, they really will work with pretty much any relational database that's out there that's got a JDBC driver. The major ones, of course, are platforms like Oracle and MySQL and a few other ones. But if you've got a relational and it's got a JDBC driver, it should be able to be picked up and worked with Teleporter. And we won't go into it in this particular webinar, but with something that you can certainly check out the OrientDB website for going forward on how you can customize the Teleporter product and the way that your Teleporter jobs essentially will bring data over from the relational side. Tremendous degree of configurability and flexibility about bringing this information across. And we're going to be talking about a few different scenarios here coming up. But that's kind of a very high-level view that I'm going to tell you in a moment about the process by which OrientDB processes its data and brings the information across. But Colin, what would you like to add to that?
Thanks, Rob. I'd really just like to add, I guess, to talk about what drivers are available, in that currently we support Oracle and SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, and HyperSQL. If you wish to extend that, there is something in Teleporter called a query builder, and it's written in Java, so you'd have to extend that yourself, though there is a generic implementation that makes it pretty easy. You just have to have a JDBC driver, as Rob pointed out, and then you extend this query builder. So pretty much any SQL database can be supported without too much effort.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I want to do in the next series of slides here is talk about the way that the Teleporter process will be carried out to bring information across from a relational database over to the OrientDB platform. And it's a very logical kind of approach. So let's begin by talking about kind of where things are at the very beginning. So we have our relational database, we've got Teleporter, and I'm going to walk you through the process by which it will do its work. So the Teleporter product's got an internal process known as the mapper that will basically interrogate the source database and pull through a query, basically through the metadata that the relational database will expose. And when you connect to your relational database, you're doing things like providing a username and password, which database you want to work with, and it will then go and interrogate the data model that you've got on the relational database side. It will pull information out about the metadata and begin to essentially establish the entity relationship model that you've got in your current database. One thing I want to point out that's important if you want to leverage this ability in the product is OrientDB will pick up on your primary keys and it will pick up on your foreign keys. But what you need to do in these platforms that Colin's just cited is to make sure that when you define your foreign keys that they actually are properly defined. They're not implicit foreign keys, but are actually using the references keyword in SQL to say where the foreign key is pointing so that it knows to be able to pick that up, as we'll be describing here in a moment. So the first phase, again, connect to the relational database, pull in the information so it can establish an ER model within Teleporter. Now, once that happens, what will then occur will be that OrientDB will essentially take the information that you've provided to it and then go back and start establishing a graph model to use the information. And you're prompted with how this actually might work. You're prompted to give it information about how you want it to behave, and I'll be describing that here coming up in a couple of moments. So it takes the ER model that it established in the first phase there and essentially constructs a graph model based on the requirements that you expressed when you were defining your job. And this is all done visually with the high degree of customization, as we were pointing out earlier. So it's taking that ER model and essentially transforming it into a graph model, which is really essentially the secret sauce here to allow this to be done, all without you having to interact with this programmatically. It's done for you essentially based on the preferences that you expressed during this design phase. Now, once that's been done, the next aspect is for it to then go and create inside the OrientDB platform, essentially to replicate the graph model that you just expressed your desire for earlier on in the design phase, takes that model, brings it across to OrientDB, and now that's ready to go on the OrientDB side. So we essentially have replicated, or established, I should say, the graph model that you want inside OrientDB based all the way back to the ER model along with your preferences to create that graph model. And now you're all set to go to the next phase, which is going to be to leverage the import engine, which I'll be describing next. So now with the import engine in place, what happens is OrientDB will then go and start pulling information via queries to get information out of the source database, out of the relational database. It'll bring it across, and you'll be getting all sorts of diagnostic information to let you know where things stand. It's pulling that information inside the OrientDB platform, and then the last aspect of this will be what happens next, which I will describe coming up right now. So once the information has been read into OrientDB's import engine through Teleporter, the last step basically is to take that data and write it out into the OrientDB platform. And again, as I described a couple of minutes ago, you're going to get all sorts of different diagnostic information to let you know how that went. And if there are any issues, you can then go back and rerun the job. You can import to a different database, whatever it might be, to get you to where you need to be. So what I've just shown you is how OrientDB's Teleporter will go through your relational database catalog and extract the information that it needs to create your OrientDB multi-model graph schema. But if it was just simply a matter of a relational database model where you had only one-to-one or one-to-many relationships, there wouldn't be that much heavy lifting for the Teleporter to do and for you to get involved with. But realistically, most relational databases will themselves, data models will have many, many relationships all over the place. These intermediate tables that are a big part of the reason that multi-model graph databases are a lot more efficient and can do some really fast traversals across your network. So what your job is when you look at the Teleporter's interaction with you as you're extracting information out of your database, you have to decide how you want OrientDB to handle the multi-table, many-to-many relationships that it's likely to encounter. And the way that you can do that is by selecting one of two primary techniques that OrientDB offers through Teleporter to explain and to set how it will create the schema on the OrientDB multi-model graph side, and that is the naive strategy and the naive aggregate strategy, both of which we're going to be exploring in the coming slides. So if we've got a one-to-many relationship, which is a very common relationship in a relational database, we can just take advantage of OrientDB's naive mapping strategy. And you express this basically graphically through the Teleporter user interface inside OrientDB Studio. So you're given a choice of the naive strategy or the naive aggregate. Here I've got a one-to-many relationship here. So what I'm doing is choosing the naive mapping strategy, and the tables on both sides of that relationship will become defined as new vertices classes, and the relationships between those tables will essentially become edges. A very simple, straightforward way of mapping information, not used really in many-to-many types of environments, but very useful here when we're doing a one-to-many approach. Now let's say you chose the naive mapping strategy if you had a many-to-many type of relationship that you wanted to model. Well, here what's happening is OrientDB is creating in the middle essentially a many-to-many vertex class and creating edges going in both directions out of that vertex class. If you look at this, top of the screen, relational model, bottom of the screen, multi-model graph approach, they look identical, and in fact they are identical in many ways. But as Colin's going to tell you here in a moment, that has performance impacts that can be kind of bad. So Colin, what do you think about this approach for many-to-many?
Right. Now, while it's naive, while it works as advertised, the problem is this junction table that gets added. In this example, it's this film actor that links the film and actors together. The problem with this is you're adding an additional edge and an additional vertex for every one of these. For a few 100,000 records is probably not a huge issue, but when you get into a distributed environment where you have nodes that may live on different servers, different distributed servers, you can incur many hops across the network to get to them. So it certainly can impact your scalability and your performance during queries.
Thanks. And I will say, having seen customers essentially attempt to do what Teleporter does for them automatically, it's very common to see people take the relational model they have existing with its intermediate many-to-many tables and replicate that by hand over in the multi-model graph environment, which if you're dealing with relatively small numbers of records, doesn't really matter. But if you're dealing with large volumes of information, it defeats the performance advantages that I described and Colin talked about earlier on. So with that said, the designers of Teleporter, I think, did a really nice, elegant solution, which I'm going to describe here in a moment, to allow us to eliminate these intermediate vertex classes and essentially get the full benefits of many-to-many without the overhead that we see in relational platforms. So we talked about the naive strategy, which essentially in a many-to-many would put an intermediate class or vertex in the middle. Here, when we use the naive aggregate strategy, which currently is the other approach that one can use, basically we use this only in scenarios where you've got many-to-many relationships that you want to bring across. What happens once again is we will see the entities themselves, the tables, become vertices, but now the relationships between these tables are expressed through aggregator edges, which will give us the full performance benefits in the OrientDB side of the equation without incurring the overhead that would have been necessary in the relational world, yet we lose none of the data modeling capabilities. So all that many-to-many is still preserved, but now it's fully taking advantage of the multi-model graph approach.
When we compare the two strategies that Robert talked about, the naive and naive aggregate, it's important to remember that both turn the RDBMS relationships into graph vertices and edges. But the naive aggregate is much more efficient because it actually removes that junction table and, in turn, the extra vertex and edge that would be created. There is an edge between the two primary tables that turn into vertices, and that edge itself may have properties just as that junction table did.
Thanks, Colin. So why would you use Teleporter? We just talked about the ways that it brings information in, the fact that you have a lot of flexibility in choosing how your model gets replicated from relational over to graph or multi-model graph. But there are a lot of reasons for people to be looking at this. That's why you're here on the webinar, right? You probably got a situation you're trying to address where you have information in a legacy relational database, or maybe there's one that's being maintained every day, having new transactions. But there are so many different scenarios, use cases. We're going to talk about 3 of them coming up here in a moment. But basically, you can think of it pretty much any kind of new application you're developing. Let's say you're building a new application on the multi-model graph platform and you want to bring over some relational database. Maybe you're one time. Maybe you've got a clean, empty database that you want to replicate a structure from a relational. Maybe you want to take data from multiple platforms, multiple relational platforms, bring it across into a combined composite solution on the graph side. Maybe you don't want to move away from your relational database at all, but you want to leverage the power of multi-model graph databases to be able to do analytics via a sidecar approach, which is a really nice, elegant way of doing things that is completely non-disruptive to your existing systems. All of these scenarios can be satisfied using Teleporter. And I know I've probably just scratched the surface here. Colin, you probably see in your daily travels a lot of other scenarios that people want to use this.
Yeah, we certainly do. One I just wanted to point out is it's really an excellent tool for walking through, visualizing your data without all the constraints of relational SQL and all the joins that are required. If you are a Gremlin user or you become proficient with Orient SQL, it's a great way to explore the data, but you can also just explore it through Studio's graphical editor, visualize your data, and get an interesting feel for those relationships without the constraints, as I said earlier, of the relational system.
So let's walk through 3 different scenarios. And again, this is a subset because there's essentially an infinite number of things you can do with this. But let's take 3 very common scenarios that people might want to use and see how this actually might work. So let's begin with one where we're taking information. We've got a scenario where we're going to move data away from the relational database, a one-time move. New applications coming up, but let's say you want to bring over all or part of your existing relational data to drive that application. So what you're doing here, basically, you're going to use, let's say, potentially the naive aggregate strategy to condense those many-to-many relationships into more elegant and better performing relationships using vertices and edges, aggregate edges. Basically, you use this one-time migration using Teleporter. It passes through the relational database. It creates the structure that you need on the OrientDB side, and then it brings all the data over in one pass, usually done one time. The new application can then start leveraging this information and carry on. You can then decommission the relational database, and you're good to go from a forward perspective after that. And a lot of times people might want to take a portion of their relational database to drive their new application, and then the new application essentially populates its data from that point forward. So very common scenario, one-time migration. Now, let's say you've got other scenarios where you want to tie in multiple systems, putting information from relational over into OrientDB, but then you want data to go back the other way into your relational database. Maybe it's a new application and you still want information to be populated back over on the relational side for other production purposes. Here what you can do basically, it's a bidirectional data migration and movement. You've got OrientDB's ability to do that through Teleporter. Right now, it's a one-way migration. Information will flow from relational over into OrientDB. You can schedule this, and it will come across however often it needs to come across. If you want to move information back in the other direction, back to the relational side of things, currently that requires you to use some additional work to use the API of the relational database and OrientDB's capabilities to push that information back in the other direction. But that can certainly be done, and it's not terribly hard to do it. But that's essentially allowing you to tie in 2 disparate applications running on 2 different platforms, yet automate as much of that as possible. And I think going forward, you'll see additional automations for that return flow of information back to the OrientDB side, or sorry, back to the relational side. Now, this is one of the most fascinating and interesting approaches, and also, by the way, is the least invasive. The notion that you can use OrientDB to conduct some very powerful, sophisticated analysis of your existing data. Maybe you won't even write a new application under the OrientDB platform. You simply want to take information out of the relational database, bring it across using Teleporter over to OrientDB, and then be able to explore the relationships that are in there. And this is leveraging the full power of graph databases while you preserve your investment in existing relational applications and the underlying platforms. This approach of using Teleporter to bring that data across is safe. I mean, it's as safe as it could possibly be because you're not touching the production system other than to pull data out of it and bring it across. You can even aggregate it. You can strip out information that should not be there. Whatever that case might be, you bring this across. You can do all the analysis you want safely on a sidecar or other kind of off the main track, essentially, approach. You don't damage any existing systems, yet you get all the benefits of graph data and graph data modeling, and essentially Teleporter kind of gets you to there in a much faster way than if you try to do it by hand. So that's kind of what I wanted to tell you, and Colin wanted to tell you about the approaches here. I'm going to take a moment here about how you can get started and learn more about OrientDB. So first of all, you can download OrientDB from the link that you see on the screen right there, including access to be able to use the enterprise version of OrientDB, and you can then take advantage of Teleporter. And it's very easy to try it out and experiment using your relational data and see it come across, and it's kind of cool to see your relational data suddenly appear in a multi-model graph. And that means you can start navigating and essentially carry out that analysis I was talking about a couple of moments ago. If you want to go to the next step and get trained on that, we certainly encourage you to visit the link on the screen right there, and we'd love to talk to you about how to train your team and get you productive as quickly and cost effectively as possible. And then, of course, if you want to reach out to Colin or myself, you can see our email addresses there, and you can learn, of course, more about OrientDB through the kind of generic email address there. So there's a lot of ways to get started and get in touch with us. Colin and I are always happy to hear from customers, but if you want to connect with OrientDB itself, there are several ways of doing that. You can see via the Twitter handle right there at OrientDB. You can certainly connect over LinkedIn, and you can also follow the company on Facebook. So with that said, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. I hope you found it useful. I know we're going to be getting here to questions, and I'll turn it over to Colin for any final thoughts from him.
Yes, thanks, Rob, for joining us today and doing an excellent job describing the benefits of synchronizing relational data into OrientDB, in particular with the Teleporter product. Thank you all for joining us, and we will address your questions now. It appears we have some few minutes left for some live questions here. First question is Teleporter available in the Community Edition? And it's a good question. Currently, Teleporter is just an enterprise feature. Requires an enterprise license to import these relational databases. Another question we have is, do you have a training course that covers using Teleporter? I'll let Robert address that one.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Yes, we do. In fact, very often we've got various classes on various topics, design, development, and administration. And in the administration class where this would really fit, we very often customize that to the exact needs of the client. So it comes to us and say, this is what our environment looks like, and then we create a training course. It's custom, if you will, around that, and can go from there.
Thanks, Robert. Another question we have is, I downloaded the Enterprise Edition of OrientDB, but I cannot find Teleporter. Where is this tool? That's a good question. It's not a standalone tool. It's actually integrated into the enterprise version of OrientDB Studio, which is our web-based interface, along with several other import tools there. Here's a good question. Can Teleporter delete records from the relational database after they've been transferred to OrientDB? Short answer is no. The whole concept of Teleporter is to pull your data in from the relational database into OrientDB without affecting anything on the relational database side. Anything you care to add to that, Robert?
Yeah, I think you could always potentially write a hook over on the OrientDB side that would call back into your relational database and remove data as the records came across, but that's something you'd want to be very careful about how you proceeded with that. But technically it's feasible, but it's just not part of the core teleporter functionality.
Very good comment. Let's see, we have another one. Do we need to install anything on the relational database server for teleporter to work? The answer is no. One thing required on the OrientDB side is that you have that JDBC driver we mentioned and some kind of connector for your database system. But nothing is required to be installed on the relational database side to make this work. Here's a question. Can I import data from Microsoft Access? As of today, the answer is no. Those databases we listed are currently what's supported. However, making this connector to a new database, especially something very similar to, say, SQL Server that follows standard SQL, is quite easy. So could be added, I guess, in short order if needed. Another question we have is, how does OrientDB support joins after importing the relational data in Teleporter? Would you like to take a crack at that, Rob?
I sure will. Yeah, so it's funny, as I was saying a few minutes ago, when you see people who are coming from the relational world over to the graph multi-model world, they're thinking in joins. That's how they think, because they've been doing that for all this time. When you get to the graph world, you're no longer thinking in joins. You're thinking in terms of vertices and edges. And the joins, the relationships that we express normally through foreign keys and where clauses in the relational world, we simply navigate out, traverse out across the edges to hit all the affected or all the relevant vertices. So their joins are represented by edges in the graph multi-model world. Once you learn how to do that, and again, you can use the straight SQL that OrientDB supplies, you should be able to get up and running and navigating across the graph very quickly.
Perfect. And this will be our last question. So it is this: does Teleporter aggregate its inserts into OrientDB by using transactions, or is it just one record at a time? It does not use transactions. It actually does import the data one vertex, one edge at a time. Now, in OrientDB itself, whenever you create an edge between two vertices, that always happens in a microtransaction, so it's guaranteed to happen, so you wouldn't have broken edges. But for the entire set coming in, it's not done in, say, like a large batch transaction. So we thank you for joining us today. Good questions. And we hope you learned something interesting from Robert and from me about Teleporter.